At exactly 3:47 p.m. on a Tuesday afternoon, IRS Agent David Sullivan walked into Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's Congressional office carrying a briefcase full of accusations and a $50,000 audit demand. He had no idea he was about to trigger the biggest corruption scandal in IRS history, and that in 72 hours, his own career would be destroyed by the very evidence he thought would silence her forever. Tell us in the comment, have you ever felt targeted by government agencies or experienced what seemed like unfair treatment from federal bureaucracy? Are you watching this from your phone while dealing with your own tax concerns? We want to know where our viewers are tuning in from around the country as we dive into this incredible story of how one congresswoman's meticulous record-keeping exposed a corruption network that reached the highest levels of government. It was March 15th when Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez arrived at her Rayburn building office expecting a typical Tuesday of committee meetings and constituent call. Her scheduler had mentioned a brief appointment with federal compliance at 3:45 p.m., which seemed routine enough. Congressional offices regularly interfaced with various government agencies on procedural matters. What she hadn't expected was Agent David Sullivan of the Internal Revenue Service, a man whose reputation for aggressive audits had earned him the nickname the Bulldozer among his colleagues. Sullivan was exactly what Central Casting would order for an intimidating federal agent. Tall, broad-shouldered, with steel gray hair and the kind of permanent scowl that suggested he'd never met a taxpayer he couldn't break. He carried himself with the authority of someone who'd spent 15 years wielding the full power of the federal government, and his track record spoke for itself. A 98% success rate in extracting additional taxes, penalties, and compliance from his audit target. As AOC's chief of staff escorted Sullivan into her office, she immediately sensed something was wrong. His demeanor wasn't professional courtesy. It was predatory confidence. He didn't wait for pleasantries or introduction. Before AOC had even settled into her chair, Sullivan was already opening his briefcase and arranging documents on her desk with the practiced efficiency of someone conducting an execution. "Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez," Sullivan began, his voice carrying the flat authority of federal bureaucracy, "I'm here to inform you that the Internal Revenue Service has completed a comprehensive audit of your tax filings for the years 2018 through 2021. Our investigation has revealed significant discrepancies that require immediate attention." AOC leaned forward slightly, her expression calm but alert. "I wasn't aware that any audit was taking place. When was I notified of this investigation?" Sullivan's smile was cold and mechanical. "Notification isn't required for routine compliance reviews, Congresswoman. What matters now is addressing the substantial underpayment we've discovered." He slid a thick folder across her desk. "Our analysis indicates you owe $47,850 in back taxes, plus $12,750 in penalties and interest, for a total obligation of $60,600. The number hung in the air like a threat. AOC opened the folder and began scanning the document, her years as a former economics student immediately recognizing inconsistencies in the calculation. The audit appeared to target specific expense deductions from her congressional campaign and early congressional salary, questioning legitimate items like travel expenses, office supplies, and even her student loan interest deduction. These calculations appear to be based on disallowed deductions that were perfectly legal under federal tax code, AOC said carefully, her voice maintaining its professional tone. "For example, you've disallowed my student loan interest deduction, which is standard for taxpayers in my income bracket." Sullivan's expression didn't change. "The IRS has determined that certain deductions claimed on your returns were excessive or improperly documented. Congressional salaries are subject to heightened scrutiny, particularly when the taxpayer has engaged in politically controversial activities." There it was, the tell that revealed this wasn't a routine audit. Sullivan had just admitted that AOC's political positions were a factor in the IRS's tax calculation, a clear violation of federal law that prohibited the agency from considering political affiliation in enforcement decisions. AOC's training kicked in. Years of navigating complex policy debates had taught her to recognize when someone was overplaying their hand, and Sullivan had just made a critical error. "Agent Sullivan, are you saying that my political activities influenced this audit?" "I'm saying that high-profile taxpayers often require more thorough review," Sullivan replied, but his tone had shifted slightly. The confidence was still there, but now it carried a defensive edge. AOC reached for her phone and opened her notes app. "I'd like to document this conversation if you don't mind. For my record, it wasn't really a request, and Sullivan's slight hesitation told her everything she needed to know. He was operating outside normal procedures, and he knew it. The bottom line, Congresswoman," Sullivan said, regaining his authoritative tone, "is that you have 48 hours to arrange payment of the full amount, or this matter will be referred to Congressional Ethics Oversight and potentially to the Justice Department for further investigation. I'm sure you understand the implications for someone in your position." The threat was unmistakable. Pay the money or face public humiliation and potential criminal charges. It was the kind of pressure campaign that had worked on countless other taxpayers who lacked the resources or knowledge to fight back. But Sullivan had made a fundamental miscalculation about who he was dealing with. AOC closed the folder and looked directly at Sullivan. "Agent Sullivan, I'll need time to review these documents with my accountant and legal counsel. As I'm sure you know, federal law requires that taxpayers be given reasonable opportunity to respond to audit findings." "Of course," Sullivan said, though his tone suggested he found the delay inconvenient. "But I want to stress the urgency of this matter. The IRS has been very patient, but our patience has limits." After Sullivan left, AOC immediately called her longtime accountant, Maria Rodriguez, who had prepared her taxes since she'd started working as a bartender in the Bronx. Rodriguez was a meticulous professional who specialized in helping working-class families navigate tax compliance, and she had kept detailed records of every deduction, every receipt, and every calculation on AOC's return. "Maria, I need you to come to my office immediately," AOC said. "Bring every document related to my tax filings for the past 4 years. Everything." 2 hours later, Rodriguez arrived with 3 boxes of meticulously organized financial records. As they spread the documents across AOC's conference table, a clear picture emerged that contradicted virtually every finding in Sullivan's audit. "Alexandria, this is bizarre," Rodriguez said, pointing to specific line items in the IRS report. "They're disallowing deductions that are explicitly permitted under federal law. Look here, they've rejected your student loan interest deduction, but the documentation is perfect and you're well within the income limit." AOC studied the documents more carefully. "What about the campaign expense allocation?" "Those are even more ridiculous," Rodriguez replied, pulling out a thick folder. "Every expense was documented with receipts, properly allocated between personal and campaign use, and reported exactly according to FEC guidelines. The IRS is essentially claiming that following FEC rules violates tax law, which is legally impossible." As they worked through the night, AOC began to see a pattern. The audit wasn't just wrong, it was strategically wrong, targeting specific deductions that would be difficult for most taxpayers to defend, even when they were perfectly legal. It was the kind of sophisticated harassment that required inside knowledge of both tax law and political pressure point. The next morning, AOC made a decision that would change everything. Instead of hiring a tax attorney and fighting the audit through normal channels, she decided to investigate who had ordered it and why. She started with a simple Freedom of Information Act request to the IRS, asking for all documents related to the initiation of her audit. The response came back faster than expected, and it was devastating. The audit had been initiated not through the IRS's normal random selection process, but through a specific referral from what the documents described as Congressional Liaison Office. More importantly, the referral had been made just 2 weeks after AOC's high-profile questioning of pharmaceutical executives during a House Oversight hearing. Armed with this information, AOC reached out to Congressman Jerry Nadler, who chaired the House Judiciary Committee and had decades of experience with government accountability issues. Nadler reviewed the documents and immediately recognized the implications. "Alexandria, this isn't just audit harassment," Nadler told her during a private meeting in his office. "This is potential criminal conspiracy. If someone in Congress is using the IRS to target political opponents, that's a felony under multiple federal statutes." Together, they decided to set a trap. AOC would request a formal hearing with Sullivan to present her defense against the audit finding. But instead of simply proving the audit was wrong, she would use the hearing to expose the corruption that had initiated it. The hearing was scheduled for Friday morning in a sterile IRS conference room in downtown D.C. Sullivan arrived with 2 colleagues and a smug expression that suggested he expected AOC to capitulate and agree to a reduced settlement. What he found instead was AOC, accompanied by Maria Rodriguez, a court reporter, and boxes of evidence that would destroy his career. "Agent Sullivan," AOC began, her voice calm but carrying an edge of steel, Before we discuss my alleged tax liability, I'd like to understand how this audit was initiated. Sullivan shifted uncomfortably. As I mentioned previously, this was a routine compliance review. AOC opened her first folder and pulled out the FOIA document. According to these IRS records, which I obtained through the Freedom of Information Act, this audit was initiated through a congressional referral dated February 28th. Can you explain what congressional referral means in this context? The color drained from Sullivan's face. That's administrative terminology. It doesn't necessarily mean... It means, AOC interrupted, that someone in Congress specifically requested that I be audited. The same week that I questioned pharmaceutical executives about price gouging, someone called the IRS and suggested they take a very close look at my tax return. She pulled out another document. This internal IRS memo, also obtained through FOIA, describes the audit as High Priority Political Compliance Review. Agent Sullivan, can you explain what makes a tax audit political? Sullivan was no longer smug. His colleagues were staring at him with expressions of growing alarm. Congresswoman, I think there may be some misunderstanding about the terminology. Let me help clarify. AOC continued. This email, sent from your supervisor to you personally, instructs you to prioritize comprehensive review of all questionable deductions and to ensure maximum financial impact on the target. Does that sound like routine compliance to you? The room had gone completely silent except for the steady clicking of the court reporter's keys. Sullivan realized he was trapped, caught in a corruption scheme that was now being documented word for word. AOC wasn't finished. She opened another folder and began pulling out receipts, bank statements, and documentation for every single deduction the IRS had questioned. Now let's discuss the actual audit finding. You've disallowed my student loan interest deduction. Here's the 1098E form from my loan servicer, my income documentation showing I'm eligible for the deduction, and the IRS's own publication explaining exactly how this deduction worked. She methodically dismantled every finding in the audit, proving not just that her returns were correct, but that the IRS had deliberately misapplied tax law to manufacture a false liability. With each document, Sullivan sank deeper into his chair, realizing that his career wasn't just over, he was potentially facing criminal charges. The final blow came when AOC presented phone records obtained through congressional subpoena power, showing that Sullivan had received multiple calls from the office of Congressman Richard Brennan, a pharmaceutical industry ally who had been visibly angry during AOC's questioning of drug company executive. Agent Sullivan, AOC said, her voice now carrying the full authority of a congressional investigation, you've participated in a conspiracy to use the IRS as a weapon against political opponents. You falsified audit findings, misapplied federal tax law, and violated the constitutional rights of a sitting member of Congress. Sullivan finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. I was just following orders. Whose orders? AOC demanded. The next hour was a confession that would reshape American politics. Sullivan revealed a network of IRS agents, congressional staff members, and political operatives who had been using tax audits to harass and intimidate progressive politicians, activists, and journalists. The scheme had been operating for over 2 years, targeting dozens of individuals whose only crime was challenging corporate interest. Within 24 hours of the hearing, the FBI had opened a criminal investigation. Within a week, Sullivan had been arrested along with 3 congressional staff members and 2 IRS supervisors. Congressman Brennan announced his resignation rather than face ethics charges and potential criminal prosecution. But the story didn't end with arrest and resignation. AOC used the exposure of the corruption network to push through comprehensive IRS reform legislation that created new oversight mechanisms, strengthened protections for taxpayers, and established criminal penalties for politically motivated audit. The $50,000 audit that was supposed to silence Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez instead became the catalyst for the largest government accountability investigation in decades. Sullivan's attempt to weaponize the tax system had backfired spectacularly, destroying his career while strengthening the very democratic institutions he had tried to undermine. 6 months later, AOC stood on the House floor to introduce the Taxpayer Protection from Political Persecution Act, legislation that would prevent future administrations from weaponizing federal agencies against political opponents. The bill passed with overwhelming bipartisan support, a rare moment of unity in an otherwise divided Congress. The investigation eventually revealed that over 200 individuals had been targeted for politically motivated audits, costing taxpayers millions of dollars in fraudulent enforcement action. A special prosecutor was appointed to handle the criminal criminal cases, and congressional hearings exposed the full scope of the corruption network. For Agent David Sullivan, the man who had walked into AOC's office with such confidence, the consequences were severe. He was sentenced to 3 years in federal prison for conspiracy, abuse of power, and violation of civil rights. His pension was forfeited, and he was banned from federal employment for life. But perhaps the most significant outcome was the precedent AOC had set for fighting back against government overreach. Her meticulous record-keeping, strategic thinking, and refusal to be intimidated had not only protected her own rights, but had exposed a systematic abuse of power that might have continued indefinitely without her courage to investigate and expose it. The lesson resonated far beyond the specifics of tax law and congressional politics. In an era when government agencies wield enormous power over individual citizens, AOC had demonstrated that even the most intimidating federal bureaucracy could be held accountable when confronted with evidence, legal knowledge, and the determination to fight for what's right. Her victory wasn't just personal. It was a victory for every taxpayer who had ever felt powerless against the IRS, every citizen who had ever suspected they were being targeted for their political beliefs, and every person who believed that government should serve the people rather than silence them. As AOC reflected on the experience months later, she realized that Sullivan's corruption had inadvertently strengthened American democracy. By trying to abuse the system, he had forced Congress to examine and reform that system, creating new protections that would benefit all Americans. The failed audit had backfired in ways Sullivan never could have imagined, transforming what was supposed to be a career-ending attack into a career-defining triumph that established AOC as a leading voice for government accountability and taxpayer rights. In the end, the IRS agent who thought he could silence a congresswoman with fabricated tax charges had instead given her the platform and evidence she needed to expose corruption, reform federal agencies, and demonstrate that in America, no one, not even the federal government, is above the law. Click subscribe to see more stories of government accountability and how individual courage can expose institutional corruption. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in our next video.